Um, Again, thank you for joining us from Canada, from the States. We have people sign up from all over the place for this town hall. So welcome to the town hall. And this is one of our two kind of free get-togethers. And the reason we started this wasn't part of our plan when the year 2020 started. But of course, when the pandemic began, we had to figure out what we're going to do. And the first things we started were virtual lunches, where we invited some of our favorite people just to get together and chat. And at that time, there wasn't a lot on Zoom, and we had a great response. And we found that even with the isolation that we're all feeling, that getting together on Zoom was a great place to connect. So we've continued our now monthly virtual lunches, and now we're doing these town halls. And generally, the town hall won't have a special guest like our very special guest today. It'll just be a time to get together and talk about what's on top, what you'll feel like talking about. But I've heard so much about the kind of the compassion fatigue and what's been going on with Zoom and with everything else. I thought we'd invite Françoise here, and I'll introduce her in just a minute. I also wanted to let you know that our next virtual lunch is just in 2 days on Wednesday at noon. And we're going to have a wonderful guest, and that's Margaret Wernberg, who's written some very excellent practical books about dealing with anxiety and depression. And she's currently writing a book on a topic she's presenting for us the end of the week on social anxiety and the relationship between the media and what that's doing to all our brains. So she's been studying that for a few years, even before the pandemic. And you need to register if you'd like to go to our virtual lunch or our webinar, but Margaret will be here on Wednesday for that. I'm going to introduce Françoise in a second, then we'll open up for questions, and then it will be kind of a dialogue together. Before we do that, I want to introduce our producer with the mostest, who's Emily. And if you've been here before, you'll know that you need to go to the chat line if you have any questions, technical problems. And then when we open up for the town hall kind of get together, there are two ways you can connect with Emily, who will put you on the screen. One is go to the chat box and say, I want a question or I want to get involved. Or the other very non-technical way is to go like this. And if Emily sees you, she will call you to the screen when it's time to do that. And for everything we're doing, including this, we always send you the link to this when it's over. So whether it's a free thing or a webinar, whatever it is, we say you don't need to be there to be there. And even if you're here today, if you have to go feed the dog, have some lunch, have a coffee, fix up a spill, you're going to get the link to this later today. So Françoise Mathieu is with us, and it's so happy to have Françoise here. She is a specialist in high-stress workplaces and high-stress realities, especially for people in the mental health and social services field. She's the founder of Compassion Fatigue Solutions, and she's a sought-after speaker and educator in Canada and now around the world, also as the co-executive director of TEND, which is an organization who works with organizations looking to train their teams about burnout, compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma, and high stress workplaces. She's really one of the leaders now in the world, I would have said Canada before, in this topic, because since 2001, she's given hundreds of seminars, a wonderful YouTube presentation on this topic, and she's probably worked with over 50,000 helping professionals in the field of healthcare, child welfare, criminal justice, social human services. I can go on and on, a lot of people she's dealt with. And she's also author of a book called Compassion Fatigue Workbook. And her December 14th webinar for us really will be 3 hours to go into the kind of issues we'll start talking about today. Is called Managing Secondary Trauma, Moral Distress, Empathetic Strain during these times of stress and uncertainty. So Françoise, so nice to see you on the screen.
Nice
Sorry we can't be in a screen together, in a room together, but I know you are a registered psychotherapist and you started out helping people. And then a long time ago, you noticed that there was stress and things that are happening to you and your family. So tell us a little bit about that, and welcome to the screen.
Thank you very much. It's so nice to see you all. And if you missed the beginning, I just I know I'm playing favorites by saying hi to my mom, but hi, Mom, who's in Mexico. So that's a lovely treat. And also a special greeting to my friend Robin Cameron, because Robin is intrinsic in this story. So she may not have expected this, and you don't have to say anything, Robin. She's like, but Robin is intrinsic, is essential to the beginning of this story. So as you were saying, Michael, I had been working in the field. I mostly have worked in crisis intervention. My area of interest was always trauma, crisis. I worked with the military for 10 years as a civilian, and I worked in the community kind of services. And really early on, Robin and I were working together, and we both noticed, we didn't have all the words we have now, of course, but we noticed what we would now recognize as service provider impairment. And so it wasn't necessarily the clients that were challenging. I mean, that was true, but we were both noticing an erosion of compassion, an erosion in service providers, whether, because we did a lot of community work. So you might be working with law enforcement, mental health, nurses, and what have you. And what was also really interesting is it wasn't necessarily correlated with years of service. So I think intuitively, there used to be this belief that burnout, as it was called, would actually accumulate over the years. And by the 15th or 20th year, you'd be crispy fried. But it's actually not what the data showed. It showed, as many of you know, that burnout or service provider impairment is actually higher at the beginning of people's careers. And so we both became really interested in that. What are ways for us to sustain ourselves, our own, how do we manage the impact? Robin was working also in domestic violence. So we were both exposed to a lot of trauma. So we wanted to figure out, how do we help ourselves, each other as colleagues, and how do we not bring this home, and how do we sustain compassion? And I guess the last piece I'll say is, it really became an action of social justice, in my opinion. And I think that might be a weird parallel for some people, but for me, becoming empathic or remaining empathic and being trauma informed is an act of social justice, so that we can stop, re-victimizing or blaming or not listening to particularly the most vulnerable people we serve. So that all started around 2001, and it started Robin and I literally going for a walk at lunch and deciding that we were no longer going to be people who were just griping about all the things we were mad about our workplace, because it was a workplace like any, with its problems and its gifts. And we started in 2001. And you're right, I've been doing it ever since.
And it was so great when you and Robin came here to do that workshop, but there's been a growth from that to 10. So just let people know a little bit about what you and 10 are doing and what 10 is. I think people know.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I partnered with Dr. Patricia Fisher, who's a clinical psychologist based in Victoria. And she's an expert in organizational health and trauma-exposed work environments. She really was a visionary. She started years ago realizing that the in-the-box organizational health assessment tools that maybe make a better factory run better, were not really working for human service organizations. So she developed a whole slate of initiatives and measures. And so she and I started working together. Lucky Pat just retired right before the pandemic, very wise. So she's living her best life in Victoria and sending me lovely messages all the time, and really not sad to be missing this part of the journey. And so now we're a team of 15, and we basically have people such as ourselves who are mental health professionals who have their own jobs outside of this, all over North America. And we do education and training. And of course, before the pandemic, it was a mixture of live and online, but of course, mostly live. And then we had to do a pretty rapid pivot. But as you can imagine, the need did not diminish at all.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a few more questions, and then we're going to open it up and also give you a chance to ask people questions if there's something you'd like to know from our audience. But first, it kind of sounds like a multiple choice test, but there are words that I get confused about what the differences are. So I'm going to ask you to define a few terms that you use and are used in the field. So the first one is compassion fatigue. And I want to know how they're different from each other. So compassion fatigue.
All right. So in fact, so I co-created a think tank on this topic in 2015 because it was, as you say, a nomenclature mess. As many of you know, physicians, for example, use burnout as the umbrella term for everything. Other groups use vicarious trauma, so on and so forth. And they were all using it at the same, in French, we say for every sauce, it was almost like So we untangled these. And so when I'm going to describe them, I want to invite you all to think of an overlapping Venn diagram. So of course there's overlap, but they're all different. So compassion fatigue is actually being rejected as a term, and it's being replaced with empathic strain. And the reason is that originally the term compassion fatigue came out of a well-meaning movement of wanting to depathologize secondary trauma caused PTSD. And the Buddhists at the time said that was a mistake because, of course, you can't run out of compassion. It's an endlessly renewable resource. Like love, it's not like when I had my second child, I was like, oh, sorry, Ethan, I gave all my love to Naomi. Like, it just didn't work like that. And I'm sure you can relate to that, Michael, since you have more than one child. So we're really moving away from that term. We're using empathic strain. So you're going to see a lot of interchangeably used language like that. And what empathic strain really refers to is this profound physical and emotional exhaustion that we notice in ourselves towards either our loved ones and or the people we serve. And we often see that either when there's chronicity. I'm sure any of you who've worked with folks who have really complex trauma, what used to be called the borderline diagnosis, which I dislike as a term, but people who are really dysregulated and who maybe you feel like you're working harder than them. You've got all this stuff that you have in place and they just don't follow through and so on. Or people who are just chronically in messy situations. And we found that in domestic violence, of course. It took a long time for people to leave. And if we weren't well informed about the cycle of violence and so on, we might get that erosion. We also see it at home though. And if any of you have read my book, you'll see that I really candidly talk about that. I didn't actually lose empathy at work. I lost it more at home when maybe the problems in my house were really trivial in comparison, that my teenager might be upset about something that to me paled in comparison to what I'd seen. And so sometimes we still have a lot of empathy at work. It's more at home that our loved ones kind of bear the brunt of that. So that's the first one in the Venn diagram.
Okay, well, let's move to vicarious trauma.
So vicarious trauma and secondary trauma are actually used interchangeably. And our 2015 think tank, we convened the leaders in the field, Lorianne Perlman, Charles Figley's representatives, like we had them all in there and we had a great, very polite bun fight about it. They've all agreed. Secondary and vicarious trauma are both indirect trauma. So direct trauma is I'm a witness to, I'm a first responder or I'm a child protection worker. I see firsthand the gore, so on and so forth. Or primary trauma is something horrible happens to someone really close to me. So 2 years ago, although he's fine, my son was a victim of a crime. That would be a direct trauma to me. I think you would understand. Secondary trauma is everything we hear through our clients, the stories they tell us, the stories we tell one another without a filter, the media reports, going to court, all the ways in which all of those stories hitch a ride with us and sometimes really haunt, our sleep and maybe even affect our view of the world and changes that permanently.
Okay. And empathic strain or empathetic strain is kind of replacing compassion fatigue so that's
correct.
So that's correct. Okay. Well, that's good. Well, that's helpful. And actually, there's a big article in the New York Times today about teacher burnout, all that's going on with them. And so they're using that word burnout, which is maybe the first word that was used to characterize people in professions having those kinds of difficulties. So what about the effect of the pandemic? I'm really curious what you're seeing. You have clients all over the place in the States and organizations in Canada or anywhere else. But what are you noticing? How have people's strain changed since March?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, Michael. So the two things I would say we've seen, definitely wear and tear, which I think will be of no surprise to anyone. And we started seeing really kind of cyclical moments of wear and tear. So for example, end of August was a significant time where we started seeing, people had been going for months with no reprieve. And we just started seeing plain old fatigue. People are exhausted. I was really touched by those of you who are in Canada, Justin Trudeau's press conference 2 weeks ago, where he was very emotional and talked about how exhausted healthcare workers are. So one of the things we saw was that at the beginning of the pandemic, I was concerned because I saw a lot of leaders treating this as if it was a 2-week problem. Some of us have all been weak. Some of us went through an ice storm or, another kind of 2-week crisis, environmental or otherwise, and people were treating it like that, all hands on deck. And I was like, and I wrote about this and I said, this is a marathon, not a sprint. You're going to burn your people out in 2 weeks. And because I spent 10 years working for the military, I know a lot about combat management, emergency medicine in combat medicine, and they pace people because it's not sustainable. So the first thing was wear and tear. The second one we're seeing a lot is moral distress, which was one term I didn't define yet. And many of you are familiar with the term, but moral distress, if you're not familiar with it, comes from the field of medical ethics. It's when our values and our beliefs come in complete, rapid conflict with rules, regulations, laws, and procedures. The bulk of the work we've been doing since the pandemic is in the child abuse world. So we have contracts with many child advocacy centers in the United States, human trafficking, child protection. They had incredible moral distress during lockdown because they knew that children were being victimized, but that the reporting rates weren't representative of that. And when they reopened certain states, what they witnessed was deeply traumatic for them. So they had secondary trauma from what they saw, but also moral distress about the lack of resources. And of course, we're seeing that in long-term care right now. They're our second biggest client right now in terms of just all the things we're all watching on the news, in terms of that experience. So those are first the two things I would say as the top two issues right now. And then of course, managing our own lives, homeschooling and all the stuff that people are trying to do.
Are you noticing different quality of this kind of distress between, say, long-term homes or people working in child abuse, or differences in professions, people who are frontline versus people who've done more in-office work? What are you noticing?
So that's so interesting you're saying that. So we're noticing, first of all, that for example, some healthcare workers feel invisible, like no one banged pots for them. A lot of my folks in long-term care said, the people we look after aren't cute. We don't deal with pediatrics. We don't deal. So I think there's a sense that certain professionals felt truly just invisible. And the other thing that happened, as you all know, if we go back in time, is that not everyone got proper PPE at the right amount of time. And even within certain institutions, not everyone got the same level of PPE. So there was also a sense of perceptions of fairness are really important in organizational health. And there were a lot of people who were feeling that they were being put in danger. The other thing I started seeing is really from the good, the bad, the ugly in terms of the communication from leadership. This has really shined a light of, any of you have ever been in your kitchen on Saturday morning when the sun's beating into the kitchen and you thought your kitchen was clean, and now you notice when the sun's there, it's like, oh, I think the sun's really shining on leadership right now. And we're really seeing the cracks in the foundation. And some leaders are really dealing with this much better than others. And so we're also seeing that in terms of good communication or lack thereof. And so, yeah, the long-term care would be the folks I think are struggling the most right now. This is obviously not data-driven, it's anecdotal. And folks who were quite happy to work from home. So my sister's a social worker, and I just talked to her this weekend, and she never wants to go back into the office. This works great for her life, she has little kids and so on. And I work with a big agency where all of a sudden they were like, no, you have to come back because we're helping extremely mentally ill homeless people. They're not going to Zoom. And so that created friction between people's fear of contagion, the mandate you have, and that kind of friction point too. The final thing I'll say is I saw a lot of management struggle with micromanaging staff. So if you'd never managed staff remotely, they didn't pivot. It was kind of like, okay, Michael, so you're not going to work together, but you have to have your camera on from 9 to 5 and tell me every time you step away to go to the bathroom. That really happened, by the way.
Really?
Yeah. Wall Street Journal. It's on Twitter. I'm not leaking anything. And so that's been really interesting too, in terms of micromanagement and not necessarily having a responsiveness to the reality of people's personal, especially this summer, people who were trying to raise kids and do a 40-hour work week. It just wasn't going to work like that. So a lot of really interesting data.
Okay, I want to open it up to our audience, and I'll say a couple of things first. If you have any questions for them, that's fine. And for everyone, the idea of the town hall is to kind of everyone to ask questions, give input. What's it like for you in your workplace, in your life? We'll all talk together. If you don't feel like coming on the screen, you can always go to the chat box and write out a statement or a question, and Emily will keep an eye in the chat box, and you can participate by either saying, I want to come on in the chat box, or just wave, and Emily will be the person in charge from now on. So there's always going to be a brave person who starts our conversations to get things going. So who would like to start with a comment? Let us know how it's going for you. And do you have any particular issues, Françoise, that you'd like to hear people?
Sure, I have questions, but I just saw Mindy raise her hand, so maybe we'll start with that, and then I can always give my questions if it's quiet.
Okay, Mindy, an old friend.
Hello, everybody, and Françoise, thank you for joining this. I recently have been reading the Nagoski's book on burnout. Do you know that one? Oh, it's really interesting, and I wondered. That's what I was wondering about. It was the idea that they're talking about. So Emily Nagoski, just very briefly, has a book called Come As You Are. She's a sex therapist, and they're twins, identical.
Oh, right. I just heard about this. Yeah.
And so it's called Burnout, like how to, but what I thought was quite fascinating in it, and I still am getting through it, is this idea, the main idea, and it's evidence-based, is that we need to complete the stress response cycle and daily. And so this idea that, because her sister, so Emily somehow intuitively knew this and was active and exercised and did stuff that helped her manage. And her sister was going through complex stress. I think she's a choral director or maybe something. And so she wound up in the hospital a couple of times with inflammatory problems. So the reality of this stress, and it's still so amazing to me how people still say, well, it's in your mind, as opposed like that kind of, and the other piece of this kind of idea of the stress response, of completing the stress response cycle, was the body, like telling the body, which I'd always been saying to clients, just tell yourself you're safe, look around, you're safe. But what they were saying is that you need to do something so your body knows you're safe. And that, like, in other words, if you were chased by a lion and you got away and you finally came back to the tribe, you told everybody the story and they supported you and there was connection and you felt safe again. So this idea of completing and not letting it, I think is kind of, just like a little cutting edge, fascinating piece of the puzzle of burnout. So
I can add to that, actually. Thank you, Mindy. And in fact, my colleague who's a psychiatrist, Jen Russell, just recommended that book last week. I've been a bit on a book buying binge, which my mom will know. It's her fault. She made me like that. But it's next on my list. But Mindy, I really wanted to actually add to that. So one of the things we've been developing have been micro strategies for folks, because micro strategies are always helpful regardless, but people are so overwhelmed right now. They don't have time. Even sometimes a lengthy webinar is too much for them in terms of just their brain space.
Yep.
And so a colleague of mine who works with me called Diana Tickes, who's a specialist in mindfulness and mindful self-compassion, she's been developing all these nano skills. So they're 3 minutes long. And one of the things she talks about, if you go to my website, they're all free. They're all under the COVID page, and they're all these micro skills.
Great.
But one of the things she talks about in her workshops is train your brain to be here, right? And that these micro skills, and what she's also talked about is that if you consolidate for 20 seconds after you've done that micro skill, so you do your 3-minute breathing space and then you wait for 20 seconds, it just allows a consolidation of that. And, before we went live right now, Mindy, I was saying to Michael that I feel incredibly well, and I'm lucky, right? I have a job, I have a safe home, but part of what I was really reflecting on is, why do I feel well after 9 months? And part of it is that I have so many tools in my toolbox because we've developed so many for 9 months, about not being future oriented right now, not getting discouraged when the vaccine has been delayed once more, And so I completely agree with that. And that sounds like a wonderful resource. And as we know, Bessel van der Kolk talked about completing the stress cycle. And so did Pat Ogden, right?
Okay.
Yeah. That's great.
I hadn't really landed on me yet. So it's thank you for those resources too. I think it's really important.
If you can put that book in the chat, Mindy, I think other people would really like it.
Okay, it'll do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Um, we have a question. Is there evidence that physical or mental maladies are due to or empathic strain or not finishing the stress cycle?
Oh, sure. I mean, okay, so what, we need to back up a little bit and recognize that there's a lot of data on chronic stress. There's a lot of data on toxic stress. And I think that there isn't as much research. There is some research on secondary traumatic stress. There isn't actually that much research on compassion fatigue or empathic strain. But part of what our think tank is saying is, trauma is trauma is trauma. Right. And so I think sometimes we get siloed where we think, oh, we don't have any research on that. But of course we do. If, any of you who've had the pleasure of hearing Gabor Mate speak in the past, his work on, his wonderful book on addiction, in the realm of the hungry ghost, his wonderful book, When the Body Says No, that looks at, the adverse childhood experiences study that are looking at the impact of chronic stress on the immune system. I think the jury's in that we absolutely know that even just chronic excess levels of cortisol have huge impacts. And in fact, it's interesting, Emily, you're asking on behalf of someone. One of the trainings we've been doing is called Managing the COVID Fog, because we've seen that a lot of people are really experiencing, short-term memory issues since the beginning of the pandemic, increased in comfort eating, things that would actually be alarming if you weren't in the middle of a pandemic. You might want to go get, assessed for low thyroid or even early dementia. And it really is related to swimming in a soup of chronic stress. So we know cortisol have those impacts. So yes, we do have data. It's just not necessarily in your lit search. You're not necessarily going to find it under compassion fatigue or empathic strain. Look at chronic stress, look at, chronic stress immune function, and you'll find that data for sure.
Thank you. David, let's get you unmuted.
I'm in a brain fog because I was trying to read unmute and I wasn't quite getting it. But anyways, thank you very much. It was just on the heels of what you were saying, Françoise, the BBC actually just had I think it was BBC News, had a really, really wonderful article on the fog that people are often in right now, and I'll try and find it and send it to Emily if I can still find it. It was a week or two ago. But what they talked about was how our working memory is being overtaxed right now because all of our automatic functions are not automatic. Things are constantly changing. I've experienced this in a different way because I just moved and spent 3 months packing and unpacking, and every single thing I reach for is not there. Now I put it over there. But that we are overtaxed, and because nothing is automatic anymore, and every time things start to get automatic, they aren't automatic. So there are things that a lot of people are having problems doing, like reading a book.
Yes.
Trying to focus on it. We're all binging on Netflix because trying to read a book is too difficult to do right now. Try to focus, those kinds of things. So that's another reason. That was a very, very helpful, lovely way that it was put together. Also, there's a new series on Netflix. I don't know if anybody's seen it yet, called The Mind Explained. I just discovered it last night. They have around 20-minute segments, memory, dreams, anxiety. The anxiety is one of my specialty areas, and anxiety was a wonderful encapsulation. It's oversimplified, it's 20 minutes. Yeah. But it was a wonderfully encapsulated bit on different aspects of anxiety and how they all fit together from the latest research. And one of the things that was really interesting about that was the idea of your body needing to hop on what somebody else had said a few minutes ago, or perhaps you did, about people needing to relearn that they're not in that spot that they were in, that their body and their mind and their body has to relearn that they're not in the space they were when the lion was chasing them.
Absolutely.
Go ahead, sorry.
Can I add a piece? Actually, I'm going to send it to Emily after, but our colleague Deb Thompson, who's a psychologist in Ottawa, at the beginning of the pandemic, created this beautiful infographic called "This is Your Brain on COVID." It could, of course, be "This is Your Brain on Chronic Stress." And she shows, if 3/4 of your brain are part of dealing with coping and all the stuff we know, and then we just have the added, just how complicated things are now more than ever before, masks lining up, what have you. What else is left for creativity? I'll send it to Emily if people want to see it. It's really a beautiful way to also do some psychoeducation with our patients and clients. And what I found is a lot of people feel relieved. You know, when you say that, David, a lot of people think, oh, I thought it was just me, or I started really wondering. But if I can extrapolate from that, because I do mostly work with organizations, my biggest challenge right now is getting leaders to understand that this is not the new normal. You know, that we actually need to revise our expectations of deliverables, of productivity. And some organizations really get it, and other organizations, we are really having a hard time getting them to understand that it's just not going to work to expect the same level of productivity as before, because a lot of people are not really dealing very well with this, or are really compromised, you know? Yeah, I'll share that with Emily, David. Oh, and of course, you just brought up another thing. At the very beginning of the pandemic, hopefully some of you had the chance to listen to the wonderful webinar that Michael hosted with Stephen Porges and his colleague about the polyvagal theory. And so to me, I found a great simplified article about understanding the vagus nerve, and I'm using that a lot in my COVID fog webinars, kind of 4 ways to, you know, activate the vagus nerve. And I thought that was a wonderful way to start the pandemic. Yeah.
Great. Someone is wondering about asking about ways we can encourage our organizations to pay more attention to this factor.
Yeah, sure. So there are a couple of resources I'd recommend. So before the pandemic, we created a business case. So we found that a lot of leaders, they need the ROI, right? The return on investment of investing in their staff. We needed to use the language of business. And that's actually worked quite well. A lot of organizations are deeply concerned about the well-being of their staff, their productivity, people going on sick leave, attrition, all of that. But there is a book that came out 2 years ago that I highly recommend. And before I mention it, I want to tell you, it has a terrible book cover. Like, it looks like something you'd buy in a sales bin. So please don't let that sway you. And it's called Dying for a Paycheck by Jeffrey Pfeffer, Pfeffer. He's a Stanford business expert. It is such a good book, and it's very current about basically the cost of ignoring workplace well-being, but really from a business metrics. And so yeah, Dying for a Paycheck, I've found a huge amount of really great data. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing that we have learned, Pat Fisher always used to say, leaders are people too, and they're often the most stressed out members of an organization. So if I can give you a quick example, in long-term care, and I know this because we've spent several years working in long-term care in Ontario in particular, directors of nursing homes are often the most burnt out people. And this was before the pandemic. And so really remembering that leaders also often have a different style, right? They tend to be more people who go into fight mode, but maybe their staff are not the same personality. Or maybe you're new as a leader and you need 2 to 3 years to get familiar with that. So we often tend to encourage leaders to do their own trainings before we roll out, you know, more general training to get kind of that literacy, you know, spread across the organization. And some workplaces are really impressing me right now, I have to say, you know.
Thank you. Oh, Rich, let's get you unmuted. There we go.
Good morning, Françoise. I'm very impressed with the depth of your knowledge. One of the things that I'm interested in is, especially for therapists, with compassion strain and wear and tear and the sense of isolation, are there online support groups for therapists or healthcare workers where they can connect with one another to counter some of these things?
Sure. So this is one of the benefits of technology, right? So I'm sure a lot of us are sick of Zoom, but also so grateful for Zoom. You know, like even just seeing your faces right now, that's a really incredible experience. I think there are quite a few different groups. I know not everyone's a fan of Facebook, but we actually created a private group on Facebook called Compassion, Fatigue, and Resiliency in Professionals. I think we have over 1,800 members. And that's been a really good place where people have been kind of connecting and talking, and they're from all over North America. So I think there are different platforms like that where people are getting a chance to connect. One of the things, and this is again, going back years ago, but one of the things I found is I needed my community of practice to be small, because if not, there was a dilution. It's kind of like, any of you were part of book clubs. Remember when those existed? And then there was attrition because there were 10 of you. So you're like, oh, I didn't read the book, I won't go. So the recommendation is that those groups be small, meaning 3 to 5 members of this community of practice. And, being able to create that network with anyone now in North America because of this platform, kind of using Zoom. So that's one place. And I know that some places, physicians, for example, some of you are familiar with Balint Group, BALINT, but we can create those easily with each other, even with this community of practice, because people don't need to be in the same city as they used, as us. So I think there's a lot of different ways to do that for sure. But then making sure there's accountability, right, Rich? Because I think sometimes people get all excited about it and then there's mission drift or commitment drift. So making sure that they're timely, they're reasonable in terms of their period frequency, but also that there's an agreement about what's going to be discussed. What I found in one of the groups I used to be part of is one person would monopolize. She always had the crisis of the month. And I felt frustrated that we didn't get to hear from other people. So having a little bit of kind of terms of agreement, we're going to talk about the following 3 things. I would highly recommend all of those for sure. Yeah.
Well, I'm kind of surprised that there aren't more Zoom compassion groups for mental health professionals. Is that the case?
I think that we are still really struggling with stigma. That's my experience. So we have tried, the Facebook group is the first group that has succeeded from our company. We've been asked for years to create things. We would create all sorts of platforms. I have explored every chat room, every platform possible. And every time we had extremely low uptake, even though we had very high interest. And I think it really still speaks to stigma about this. So I'm always happy to keep trying, but Facebook was the first time we had success. It is a closed group. So I think there was a bit of a sense of safety because we moderate everything in there. But it's the first time we've had success creating a community of practice. So yeah, I think we still have a ways to go, that people still feel really self-conscious about that. But physicians are doing a good job. My friend in BC has a physician support group, within her subpart. So I think also just going to your college or to your membership and finding out if there are a few people who are comfortable doing it and starting that way. I know my mom has an international group of people who do coaching, for example, and they meet regularly. So it can be done. We just need to be the people who start it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of people have added, so NAMI, N-A-M-I, Wisconsin has a weekly virtual group session for teachers. If it's open to anyone. Someone else said that peer supervision has been very helpful for my colleagues and myself. It has morphed from mostly clinical to personal and clinical hybrid, which includes the support, which is another great idea. Someone wanted to know what was the article that explained the polyvagal theory in simple terms.
Oh, right. It's by Adamson, and it's called 4 Ways to Activate the Vagus Nerve.
I'll put that in the chat, the chat room. I see hands moving, but not actually waving.
And by the way, we will put all the resources in the email everyone's going to get with the link to this. So if you don't see it in the chat box or you're not taking notes, you're going to get it with all those links later. Okay.
I have some questions if people.
Sure.
Okay. I actually have 3. So I have a question about leadership. I have a question about stigma, and I have a question about tools that people have found useful. So maybe we could start with that one. What has been the #1 tool that you have found useful to reduce your own stressors during the last 9 months? What's helped?
Oh, Sharon, let's get you unmuted. There we go.
I took up biking. So I cycled and I joined a bike challenge for cancer in Ontario, and biked 600 kilometers in 1 month.
Wow.
So now it's just how to keep going. The biking's over. What do I do now? But yes.
You mean, Sharon, like because the season's changing?
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
So what are you going to do?
I bought snowshoes. So I'm going to do snowshoeing, and I go for walks, go for hikes. But yeah, that's been my way of, because I've been working at home since March, and it's been really difficult. I work in the court system, so I'm a victim service worker with the Ontario government. So it's been quite challenging to work from home with that kind of work.
No kidding. Well, I think it's interesting, Sharon, because were you biking with other people?
I found one other person yet that I started cycling with. So I either biked alone or I biked with her. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Not a
it,
crowd,
yeah, yeah. So it wasn't the crowd factor. So it sounds to me also that what you need to replace it with is something that has the same level of intensity, right? Because I walk 4 or 5 times a week, but it's not the same as going for that extra, getting that extra kind of kick.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know. I've seen that these are expensive, of course, but I've seen a lot of people, investing in Pelotons or investing in fat bikes, basically working with the seasons. And I think that for those who can afford it, those have been incredibly helpful to them, right? In terms of making sure they have something that they can do throughout our weird and wacky seasons.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Sharon. Anyone else what's been the number one tool you've used?
Lori has her hand up. Lori, do you want to? Oh, sorry. I think I just muted you by accident. There we go.
I think I'm unmuted now.
Yeah, there we go.
Hi. So I found for me, I'm in private practice, and I completely changed my schedule so that I could pace myself and have bigger gaps during the day. Sometimes I go for walks. It's nice to be able to pick up my kids from school and spend a couple hours with them. So more fill your cup activities that are focused around family and things I was so used to being at the office kind of all day, every day, that working from home's given that autonomy to make those changes and not to feel guilty about it. I think we get trapped in this cycle of productivity as a measure of self-worth, or so really breaking away from those concepts, kind of unhooking inside. And then I have a clinical supervision group that I meet with. It is a small group, like you said, it's about 6 to 8 people. We meet monthly, and I find that really, really helpful, even if I'm just hearing other people's cases, but it's that idea to connect and see people, because it's very, very lonely working from home at times.
Absolutely, Lori. And it's so interesting you say that. I have a sticky right here on my computer that says toxic productivity. And I think that
we get stuck in that, right?
Sure do. And, I have a friend who's also a mental health professional, and she told me that she feels guilty going to the bank in the middle of the day, that she still feels like somehow she has to wait till 5 o'clock to go to the bank. And I was like, I'd like to unpack that a little bit, like.
It's such a liberating experience to start breaking some of those, like the way we used to live. And I think the pandemic in some ways has brought the opportunity to reflect on, do we want to keep living in that toxic productivity? Was that really worth, was that really worth it when you start to lose things like connection? You start to value things differently, I think.
I completely agree with you. And I think that it's going to be really interesting as whatever the heck is the next iteration of this, but as, when the vaccine comes, and some people are asked to return to the way it used to be, but there might be quite a few people who say, actually, I don't want to do it the way it used to be. I want to do a hybrid. And I'm predicting that too, Lori?
I really feel for my peers, because I actually left a workplace environment that wasn't very toxic. It was a really nice workplace environment, but I left it to be able to manage my schedule in a healthier way instead of that toxic productivity. And I really feel for a lot of my peers that are still in agencies that don't get it, right? They just, they're stuck in their own cycles that reinforce this idea of productivity as self-worth and work as hard as you can. And if you're not working that hard, then there's something wrong with you innately. So I do feel like the systems still have a long way to come.
I agree. And actually, thanks. I'm going to bring my second question up. And another book, one of my favorite books about productivity is by Cal Newport, and it's called Deep Work. And some of you may know him. Cal Newport is a Georgetown computer scientist, a professor, very productive man, has 3 little kids, New York Times, New Yorker, all of that, but in a very different way. He wrote a book about digital minimalism, and his next book coming out in March is about the end of email. Hallelujah. Can't wait for that. But he talks a lot about deep work and about switch tasking and about, productivity. And I'm sure some of you know this, but people who do knowledge work, the limit to the amount of concentration or productivity in a day is between maybe sometimes 4 hours at the most, but often 2 hours maximum. And so, kind of looking at changing the way that work is done, which is of course different from direct client service. So my next question is, do you have examples of compassionate leadership that you have witnessed?
I see someone with their hand up. Bernie?
It's Bern.
Bern?
Yes. And I'm sorry, I couldn't find the hand up thing to respond to the first question. So, but I live in a remote community in the Northwest Territories of about 500 people.
Yeah.
So it's a fly-in community. And my challenge becomes relating to people who have to give up things because where we are, those walks, those nature walks, those kinds of things, that's exactly why we're here.
Mm-hmm.
And it what fuels us in so many ways to begin with. So and I chuckle to myself as I say, geez, I wonder how they would like this. But yesterday I went for a 4-kilometer walk on a frozen lake.
Yeah.
Geez, it was really boring, but it was quite refreshing in many, many ways.
Yes.
But the other component that's a part of what this is that this medium of communication or similar types have been the only, I shouldn't say only, but the primary source of communication other than telephone for outside professionals. So it's not the adjustment period for us here in the North End, what it's like is different, but we have internet challenges, of course. So there's, trying to find the balance of what those things are about. But generally speaking, I at times have said, well, I'm glad you folks are catching up to us. It's a kind of a very positive place for us to be in that particular thing. So I hope that I just shed a little different, because coming from where you folks come from, where you had to give up a number of things.
Yes.
Well, we really haven't given up the same things, but we need to have the same things to begin with.
Absolutely.
So our sense of values and sense of how we communicate and what we do was very different. So I just wanted to throw that in there so you know that every answer we have doesn't give us the complete answer.
Very true. Thank you so much. I've had the chance of traveling up to the territories, and it's something I miss very much right now in terms of connecting with folks up there. So thank you for that.
Well, we're still here for you.
Well, it's interesting because what you're highlighting also, when we were talking about moral distress earlier, one of the things a lot of my service providers experienced was moral distress around their clients not having data plans. So, for example, I had clients whose kids had a chance, they had a limited data plan, so they could either have an hour of therapy or they could have an hour of schooling. Right. So the discrepancy right now in terms of data and accessibility, which, feels very close to a human rights at this point. And this has really highlighted that, for people in more remote areas for sure. Right.
Well, we're looking forward to Elon Musk's venture.
Exactly. Thank you.
To provide us more service.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Merci.
Any other comments, Emily?
A couple of, Adriana is raising her hand. Do you want to unmute?
Hi. So I guess I just wanted to say a couple things. I work in mental health court support, so it definitely is a pretty stressful environment, and we've had to kind of pivot and try to see how we can do our work differently. I definitely relate to the moral distress piece because we're doing release plans over the phone, and there's not a lot of services and supports to refer people to. The other thing too, like people with like serious mental health issues, and I'm just like a voice on the phone. So I've gotten kind of worked into like people's delusions and all sorts of like weird stuff where they just don't connect. So that's been a bit problematic. But I guess what I wanted to respond to was what you talked about with the leadership piece. And I've seen my manager has done kind of like a mixed job. There's some things that she's done really, really well. And I think one of the things that she did do well was she's very encouraging. She's basically keeps on telling us that we're doing a really good job under very difficult circumstances. She's encouraged us to take breaks, all that kind of good stuff. What I see happening though is that she'll say something and then she'll come back in a meeting and she'll kind of take it back. And I'm thinking she's getting pressure from her higher ups to do things like, to not do the things that she just told us was okay to do. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that in any way.
So she has to walk back in a way, right? She has to walk back what she offered. And so that's so interesting. Yes, I've seen that quite a bit. And, we could unpack that a little bit more and wonder, is it that she's a conflict avoider and that she actually says things to you that she knows are not, and I'm not trying to be judgmental of her, but, is it possible that she's a conflict avoider and she's actually saying things to you that she knows are going to get backtracked, but she doesn't want to face your frustration or your ire? So one. Number two is that she really means those things. And then someone at the other level is blocking her, and that there's another level, there's another upper layer there where there's friction. And it sounds like that might be the case. And that she actually hopes that some things she can slide some things through that won't be kind of micromanaged, right? And that's definitely really challenging. So we actually have, I'll add it to the resources, Emily, but we have a free 1 hour webinar on compassionate leadership. It was actually a fireside chat I did with two of my colleagues. It was really good. I was just the interviewer, but they did a fabulous job looking at compassionate leadership during the pandemic. And it's so striking to me what leaders are really doing that is working. And Adriana, you talked about giving people positive feedback. I think it's often forgotten, right? Just like that you actually did a good job. But what we're seeing, Linda Duxbury did a wonderful talk a couple of weeks ago, and she said, COVID is a leadership test and it requires new frontiers of flexibility. And I think that's part of it, right? Trusting our staff, not micromanaging them. Global accommodations. So I started hearing friction from people who did not have children. They'd say, so my workplace is accommodating people with kids without even checking that maybe I have caregiver needs, but nobody asked me. So the recommendations, Harvard Business School is producing some phenomenal free stuff right now about compassionate leadership during COVID. Everyone should get the same accommodation. You don't need to explain why. We all have different needs. Maybe I have anxiety and I need an hour off to exercise. That's just as valid as looking after a child, is it not? Right? So kind of helping leaders understand. But the problem is they all have to report somewhere as well, right? The chain continues. And what a lot of my folks are saying is the work has to be done. It's not negotiable. I'll give you a quick example. I can't say who they are, but I was working last week with someone, their organization, on a very, very, very big project, billions of dollars. They keep telling me how big their budgets are. I'm like, I know, gazillions of dollars, good for you. But part of it is they're not saying that to say that they're important, more important. They're saying that to explain to me the pressure they feel. And any of you who've worked with clients who say nothing it's all immovable. I can't change one single thing, right? Folks who are like, nothing can change. And I'm like, okay, so nothing can change. All right. Except maybe them leaving their job. And it's really interesting to me that constriction that they get into, like there's not a single piece that can shift. But the problem is if 6 months from now, people end up on sick leave or stress leave. If some of you saw the New York Times article a couple of days ago about the suicide rate in physicians and nurses right now, it was a really deep, dark article. I mean, penny wise and pound foolish, right? So I think part of it is we need to educate leadership about the fact that the deliverables are not going to, we are not going to meet our targets. We're just not. And it's a really difficult thing to swallow because it has side effects. Well, if we don't have that, we don't get our grant renewed, or the numbers, right? A lot of workplaces, they have metrics that they have to meet. So I'm not suggesting this is easy. It's at every level that we need a shift to take place. I don't even think I answered your question, Adrienne, at all. Just went down my rabbit hole.
That's okay. Yeah, it's really tough. I don't think there are any easy answers.
No.
So it's just, yeah, not quite sure what to do, but I just try my best to, I guess, do the little pieces that I can to try to make it work, as well as, you know, as much as I can support, I guess, myself and my team, and also and look at it as we're all in it together. So there's ways also that I can support, you know, my manager and doing her job, which might be helpful. So
yeah, you remember Stephen Covey's circles of control and influence, you know, and to me, it's been so helpful my whole career to see these are the things I have control over. The things I have influence over are my conduct, how I relate to my colleagues, whether I choose colleagues who are totally cynical or I choose colleagues who are constructive. And then there's things that are totally outside of, you know, my control completely. And those are daily decisions. I really think years ago, Cheryl Richardson, who's an author, had the best quote. And she always said, do not confuse difficult choices with no choice.
yeah.
And to me, that's really helped me make decisions, sometimes to leave certain workplaces, sometimes to stay, but also commit to, you know, things within the limits. You're right. It's really complicated, but I think that we all have the power to make decisions about this is within my control and this is not. David?
There was just one thing I wanted to add to that, and that was I've actually found, and I got this from my wonderful dietitian, bless her heart, okay, who, when I was not able to make changes and not able to make changes, she'd present all this wonderful stuff to me and I just couldn't do it. She looked at me and she said, is there just one small thing that you can make a change in? Just one small thing. If there was something like that, what would it be? And I found that was a lot more accessible, and I brought that into my client work, and I use that hugely now, especially with people who really truly believe that there is no option for them. There's no option, there's nothing. So rather than get frustrated and look at them going, well, why are you sitting with me paying your money if you if you don't think anything can change? Rather than doing that, I look at them and I go, you know, is there one small thing? And I was surprised what a doorway that is for so many people. They'll look at me and go, oh, well, you know, I could not check my email outside of work hours just for now, or for tonight, or for the next couple of days, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's been extraordinary, actually, how that works, to bring it down, like we need to do with so many things during the pandemic, to just bring it down to something small.
Micro movements. And in fact, Robin years ago introduced me to a book called One Small Thing by Bill O'Hanlon.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Micro movements.
Yeah.
Well, you know, I think we're almost out of time. I'll tell you what I've been doing, Françoise, and anyone else who's listening that's really been useful, and it was even before the pandemic, is if I can, I don't look at my emails from Friday at 5 to Monday at 9. Now, it doesn't mean I'm completely technology free, because the weekends of the time I might do Zoom or FaceTime calls with friends or family. I kind of save it. But I'll tell you, that's really been and I do it most of the time. Now, maybe there'll be the occasion I won't, but not knowing I'm not looking really is working for me.
I'll share one before we finish, Michael. One of the things I found, I was overwhelmed with multitasking, you know, because we're all working, my whole business is remote now. So we have Slack and like notifications, it's constant. And what I do now is I complete a task. Like I turn all notifications off. And if I start a task, I finish it. Like just one task from start to finish. I don't mean like writing a book, obviously that's ridiculous, but you know, and that has dramatically reduced my stress level. Speaking of micro skills, yeah.
Well, Françoise, I want to thank you and remind people that this is like kind of the commercial. You'll be back on December 14th with 3 hours of very practical ideas about all these things, really the webinar. On December 28th, you're all invited to a town hall. Now, we generally never do things at Christmas. We close down at Christmas, but I thought, you know, this year with the isolation, we're all feeling we're not going to be having a lot of family dinners together or traveling a lot. So if on December 28th at noon Eastern time, you want to come back, we're just going to kind of check in and just be with each other and see how we're doing and talk and have a little bit of holiday time together. That's December 28th. Reminder that on this Wednesday, we're going to have Margaret Wernberg, who's written a lot about social anxiety and what the media is doing to us. And she's going to be here for a free lunch Wednesday at noon, and doing a webinar as well on Friday. So anyway, what we like to do, Françoise, our little connecting after all our events, we open our microphones and everyone can say goodbye to each other, goodbye to you, and thank you. So everyone, thank you for tuning in. We'll open the mics and we'll end on that note. Thanks again, Françoise.
Thank you all.